Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling The Betrothal in Santo Domingo by Heinrich von Kleist, published in the year 1811. It is a story from the days of the great uprising on Haiti, about a house in the night, about a stranger who asks to be let in, and about a young woman who stands between all worlds. Make yourself comfortable. Breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into a dark, warm night at the edge of the mountains. On the island of Haiti, in the years when the black population rose against their French masters, there lived on the plantation of Monsieur Guillaume de Villeneuve a man named Congo Howango. He came from the Gold Coast of Africa, and his master had shown him much kindness, had given him his freedom, a house, a livelihood, and had set him over the other servants. But when the uprising broke out and the land stood in flames, Howango forgot all these kindnesses. He took up arms, shot his master with his own hand, set the main house afire, and roamed the region with the armed men to hunt down the fleeing whites who tried to make their way to the coast in troops and scattered little groups, where ships were waiting. In the house on the country road that had remained to him, he left behind, whenever he set out, 2 women, old Babacan, a mulatto woman who kept his household, and her daughter, Toni, a girl of 15, fair-skinned, born of a white father from Europe whom she had never seen. And Howango had charged the 2 of them with a cruel task. If in the night a white fugitive came to the door and asked for shelter, the women were to receive him kindly, give him food and a bed, and keep him occupied with conversation and good words until Howango returned with his men. The daughter's fair skin was the best bait, for what hunted man would mistrust a house in which a girl with an almost white face opened the door to him? More than one unfortunate had already met his ruin through this hospitality. Now, on one night, Howango had been away with his men for days. There came a late knock at the back door of the house. Babacan opened the window on the upper floor and asked down who was there. A man's voice answered softly and in broken French with a foreign ring. A traveler, an officer, who needed help, for himself and for his people, who had been left behind in the woods. Whether a Christian lived in this house who would open the door to a hunted man? Babacan looked down into the yard, in which only the one man stood, and called to him to wait, and woke her daughter. Toni dressed, and as they went down the stairs, the old woman whispered to her what was to be done. The stranger was a white man, alone, evidently of rank, and Howango could be back any hour. They would therefore take him in as they had taken in the others. Toni nodded. She knew her role. She took the lamp, drew back the bolt, and opened the door. Outside stood a young man in a dusty coat, tall, with a face marked by exertion and sleeplessness, and yet of a kind that struck Toni before she willed it. He started at the sight of the girl, then composed himself and asked who lived in this house. Toni said her mother and she, a mulatto woman and her daughter, no one else. The stranger hesitated. He looked at the lamp, the girl, the dark hallway behind her. Then he said he would be open. He was a white man, an officer from Switzerland. His name was Gustav von der Ried, and he was fleeing with his family to the coast, a party of relatives, women and children among them, whom he had left behind in the woods by the gull pond, exhausted and without food. He had been sent out to seek help and knew that he was placing his life in the hands of a stranger if he entered here, whether betrayal dwelt in this house or mercy. Toni stood with the lamp in her hand, and the light fell on her face, and for a moment she could not get out a word. Then Babacan appeared behind her on the stairs and called in a friendly voice for the gentleman to come in, for God's sake. What was he thinking? In this house no one feared him, and no harm would come to him. They led him into the parlor, set bread and wine before him, and the old woman began to spin her web of laments and assurances. How hard the times were, how much they too, the women, suffered under the fury of the black population, for one could see her daughter was almost white, and the child was looked at askance and tormented for it. Gustave ate and drank and listened, and the mistrust with which he had crossed the threshold began to subside. He asked to whom the house belonged. "To a black man named Huango," said the old woman, "but he was away with the troops for days to come." And while she spoke, Gustave kept glancing over at Toni, who stood silently by the hearth and lowered her eyes whenever his met them. It had grown late. Babakan said a room would be made ready for the gentleman, and tomorrow, by daylight, they would consider how to help his family in the woods. She sent Toni ahead to prepare the bed for the guest. Toni carried water and fresh linen into the guest chamber, and Gustave followed her with the light. While she made up the bed, they stood alone together for the first time, and Gustave, to break the silence, began to speak. He asked her about her age, about her father, and Toni told what she knew, that her mother had brought her from Europe, from Paris, that her father had been a rich merchant who had not married Babakan, and that she had never seen him. Gustave looked at her in the glow of the single candle and then said, half to himself, that she reminded him of someone. Toni asked, of whom? And now he told, with a voice that grew darker, of his betrothed at home. A girl named Marianne Congreve, whom he had lost in Strasbourg in the days of the Revolution in France. He himself had endangered himself through an ill-considered speech against the Revolutionary Tribunal. They were looking for him, to bring him to trial, and when the pursuers did not find him, they seized Marianne. And Marianne, led before the tribunal and asked where he was, said she did not know his whereabouts, and, to draw the furious men off his trail, professed, with a courage that no man could have surpassed even to views that meant death. They led her to the scaffold. Gustave, to whom friends brought news of it, rushed out of his hiding place, forced his way through the crowd, and cried that here was the man they sought, that she was innocent. But Marianne, on the platform, turned her head aside, looked at him with a look he would never forget, and then said to the judges that this man was unknown to her. And the blade fell. Gustave was silent for a while when he had told this. Then he said that since that hour he carried his life like something borrowed, and only here, in this room, had he for the first time met again a face that reminded him of her. Toni stood by the bed, her hands on the linen, and within her was a confusion she did not understand. The man she was meant to keep occupied until Huango came sat before her and laid down his life to her like a person one trusts. And the most terrible thing was this. He was right to trust her and did not know it. And he was wrong to trust this house and did not know that either. What happened then happened as such things happen, out of fear and closeness and lostness, in a night in which two people held fast to each other, each, in their own way, a fugitive. As the morning grayed, Toni lay awake and knew that in this night her whole life had turned around. She belonged to him now. Morning came, and with it came the fear. Toni knew what the house was and what her mother intended, and now she knew too what she herself wanted, to save this man at any price. But she was 15 years old, and between her and his rescue stood her mother, the mistrust of the black population in the village, and the hour in which Huango would return. She resolved for now to keep silent and go on playing the role she had been given. At breakfast, Babakan sat smiling amiably beside the guest and spun her threads further. Gustave pressed that carts and help be sent that same day to his family at the Gull Pond. His relatives were waiting there without food. 3 days already they had been on the road. The old woman shook her head and found reasons for delay. The roads were unsafe by day. The troops of the black population roamed the land. One must wait for the night. Then they would fetch the family and hide them in the house until the way to the coast was clear. It sounded like care and was calculation. For the more whites in the house, the richer the prize when Huango returned. Gustav, to whom the safety of his people was everything, let himself be convinced. Toni sat by and was silent, and every word of her mother's fell on her like a stone. In the course of the day, however, something happened that brought the danger nearer at a stroke. A messenger came to the house. Huango was expected back earlier, perhaps as soon as the coming night, at the latest the morning after. Babakan received the news with satisfaction and whispered to her daughter that now everything was falling into place. They need only keep the stranger in the house this one more night. Toni nodded and felt herself grow cold. In the evening, as they sat together, the old woman tested the guest in her way. She spoke of the atrocities of the whites, of the vengeance that was now coming upon them, and asked how he thought about the cause of the black population. Gustav answered guilelessly and openly, and over the conversation there lay for Toni something unbearable. She saw her mother laying the snare and saw the man who trusted her step into it, step by step. In the night, when the house was still, Toni crept into his chamber. She did not wake him. She stood by his bed and watched him sleep, and within her the two lives wrestled, the old one at her mother's side, and the new one that had come into being in a single night. Then she formed a resolve, knelt down by the bed, and swore to herself and to him, the sleeper, that she would save him, even if it cost her own life. The next day passed in anxious calm, and Toni searched for a way. In the evening, so it had been arranged, a messenger was to go to the gull pond and bring the stranger's family to the house. Toni understood that in precisely this lay a possibility. Once the relatives were there, strong men among them with weapons, then Gustav was no longer alone. So she encouraged her mother in the plan, as if serving her, and at the same time quietly urged haste. But it turned out otherwise. In the middle of the night the house lay in its first sleep. The dog below gave the alarm, and then there were voices in the yard. Horses, weapons, the clatter of gear. Congo Huango had returned, earlier than even the messenger had announced, with his whole troop. Toni started up from her bed. She heard her mother open the door below, heard muffled, hurried talk, and she knew what was now being said. That a white man slept in the house, above, in the guest chamber, unsuspecting, a ripe fruit. Minutes were left to her. Flight was no longer to be thought of. The house was full of armed men, the yard occupied, and if she woke Gustav and he defended himself in his desperation, he was lost. A single man against 20. And then, in this utmost strait, Toni hit upon a thought as desperate as the situation itself. If she could neither hide him nor free him, then she must hand him over, in appearance, so thoroughly that no one doubted her loyalty, and thereby gain time, a night, a day, until help arrived. For one thing she knew, the family at the gull pond was waiting, men with weapons, and the way there could be made in a few hours. She took a rope, and with a pounding heart, fighting back the tears, she stepped into Gustav's chamber. He slept deeply, his face turned toward the window. Toni bound him as gently as she could at hands and feet to the bed frame, drew the knots tight, and stepped back, as the footsteps were already on the stairs below. Gustav woke from the binding, saw her standing at the foot of the bed, the rope still in her hands, and behind her, Huango and his men pressed into the chamber with lights and rifles. and in his eyes Toni saw the most dreadful thing she had ever seen. Not fear, contempt. Hoango stepped to the bed, regarded the bound man and then the girl, and Babakan behind him told with rapid words how cleverly her daughter had acted. The white man had grown suspicious and wanted to flee, so Toni had bound him then and there, that the prey should not escape. The men laughed. Hoango nodded his approval to the girl, and Gustav lay on the bed and heard it all. He spoke not a word. He only looked at Toni, a single, long look, and then turned his face to the wall. Toni bore it. That was her deed in this night. She stood there and let herself be taken for a traitor, for only so did the others believe her. Hoango decided to make short work of the prisoner only in the morning. The night belonged to rest, and then he learned from Babakan the rest as well, that at the Gull Pond lay the white man's family, women, children, and a few men, and that they had meant to fetch them that evening. Hoango's eyes lit up. That was a greater catch, and he would go and get it at daybreak with his men. Toni heard it, and her heart stopped, for with that, her plan of getting the family into the house as rescuers was shattered. But then she saw a new, last door open. She stepped up to Hoango and said, with a firmness she did not herself comprehend, that the family would never follow armed black men. They would shoot and flee, and all would be lost. One must use cunning. She herself would go ahead in the early morning, as the prisoner's messenger, with a token from him, and lure the unsuspecting into the house, straight into Hoango's hands. The old man looked at her, weighed the plan, and found it good. So it was decided. Before daybreak, the house asleep again, Toni crept once more into the prisoner's chamber. She bent over him. He turned away, but she whispered close to his ear, hastily and softly, that she had not betrayed him, that the bonds were his rescue, that she was now going to his family to warn them and fetch help, and that for his life's sake he should lie still and wait whatever happened. Whether he believed her, she could no longer tell, for outside it was growing light and she had to go. She went out of the house, past the dozing guards, and then she ran the way to the Gull Pond as she had never run in her life. At the Gull Pond, among swamps and dense thickets, she found the camp. Herr Strumny, Gustav's uncle, a man of gray hair, his wife, his sons, and the servants, exhausted and anxious about the man they had sent out, of whom there had been no word for 2 days. Toni stepped among them, breathless, and told everything: who she was, what the house on the country road was, what her mother and Hoango were planning, that Gustav lay bound in the chamber and that his death was set for the morning, and that she herself had come to save him against her own house. The men sprang up. Herr Strumly, old as he was, took command with a calm voice. The women and children were left under guard in the camp, and that same night the men set out, armed, Toni leading the way along hidden paths she had known since childhood. Before the house all lay still. Toni knew where the guards stood and where the boys slept, Hoango's boys, whom he kept like sons, and this circumstance became the key to the attack. The men broke in from 2 sides. There was shouting. Shots fell in the dark. The surprised black men fought back and were driven into the yard, and Herr Strumly's sons seized the boys as hostages, at which Hoango, who stood in the hallway with raised weapon, froze in mid-motion. They negotiated with looks and gun barrels, the children for free withdrawal. While in the yard everything was still in an uproar, 2 of the young Strumleys sprang up the stairs into the chamber and cut the prisoner's ropes. Gustav staggered up, free, his limbs numb, a captured pistol in his hand. and in this moment Toni pressed through the door toward him with outstretched arms and a face in which everything was at once fear and exhaustion and an immense joy. He saw her coming, the traitor who had bound him, who had handed him over to Huango and lured his own family into the trap, as he believed, and all the torment of the last night shot together in him to a single point. He raised the pistol and fired. Toni collapsed in the doorway. The report still stood in the room when Herr Strumley was already beside her, and behind him, one of the sons screamed into his cousin's face what he had done. "It was she who fetched us. She saved you. She saved us all." Gustav stood as though the shot had struck himself. They carried Toni onto the bed, the same bed to which she had bound him the night before, and the light fell on her face, which was already growing white. She still lived. Her eyes sought Gustav, and when he threw himself down beside her and gripped her hands and called her name again and again, she said softly, with failing voice, the words he would never be free of for the rest of his life, however short that life was measured. "You should not have mistrusted me." Then she died. The men stood around the bed, and in the yard below the enemy waited, and there was no time for grief, no time for comprehension. But Gustav comprehended. He comprehended in that moment everything. The bonds that had been his rescue, the performance before Huango, the errand through the night, the whole extent of what this girl had dared for him, and how he had repaid it. He rose, calm as it seemed, stepped a pace to the side, and before any of the men could prevent it, he raised the pistol with which he had shot Toni, and shot himself through the head. Now two lay in the chamber. Herr Strumley, who in a single hour had been robbed of his nephew and of his nephew's rescuer, did what a man in such a situation must do. He held the living together. The withdrawal was forced step by step, the boys in the middle as pledge, and Huango, who cared more for the children than for revenge, let the whites go. They took the two dead with them. At the gull pond, the rest of the family joined them, and then the party marched in haste to the coast, through a land that burned behind them, and reached the ships, and the sea took them in. Weeks later they landed in Europe. Herr Strumley returned with his people to Switzerland, to his home by the Rigi, and there, in the earth of a garden, beneath a simple stone, he had the two buried who, on the burning island, had been betrothed for a day and 2 nights. Gustav von der Ried and Toni, the girl from the house on the country road, who stood between all worlds and, in the one night on which everything depended, chose love. The stone named both names side by side, and whoever passed by there in later years and knew the story would surely pause a moment and think of what mistrust brings about. There, where trust would have saved everything. That was our short retelling of The Betrothal in Santo Domingo by Heinrich von Kleist. A young woman risks her life to save the one she loves, and a single moment of doubt undoes everything. What remains is her sentence, softly spoken and no longer to be taken back. You should not have mistrusted me. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.